Chapter 13 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 13. Paul Belloni du Chaillu, discoverer of the dwarfs and gorillas. Among the thousands of vigorous and adventurous men whom chance brought to light in foreign climes, but who by choice have cast their lot with America by becoming citizens of the United States, there are few whose explorations and discoveries have excited more popular interest and discussion than have those of Du Chaillu, the discoverer in modern times of the dwarfs and the capturer of the gorilla. Born in Paris, July 31, 1835, the early environments of Paul Belloni du Chaillu fostered and forecast his taste for African exploration, for his father was one of the adventurous Frenchmen whose consular appointment and commercial enterprises led him to settle at the mouth of the Gaboon, on the west coast of Africa, where his distinguished son passed his boyhood. While young Du Chaillu was, doubtless, well grounded in ordinary sciences by his instructors, the learned Jesuit fathers, of Gaboon, yet apart from regular educational institutions, he imbibed other wealth of learning by observation of the rich tropical world around him, and also through a familiar intercourse with neighboring tribes, acquired a knowledge of native tongues and craft, of savage habits and character, which ensured his after success in African exploration. Commercial pursuits brought Du Chaillu to the United States in 1852, when he was so strongly impressed by American institutions that he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. Du Chaillu was brought prominently before the American public by a series of striking and interesting articles on the Gaboon country, which, from their favorable reception, strengthened his belief in the importance of thoroughly exploring certain portions of the west coast of Africa. The region selected for his investigations was under the burning sun of the equator, somewhat to the north of the Congo country, in the basins drained by the Muni, Ogawi, and Rembo rivers, which, owing to difficulty of access, extreme heat, prevailing fevers, and deadly climate, were practically unknown. Between 1856 and 1859, Du Chaillu journeyed upward of 8,000 miles through this country, traveling on foot, with no white companion, and with the aid of natives, cursorily explored nearly 100,000 square miles of virgin territory. Working with the ardent zeal of a naturalist, his enormous ornithological collection aggregated thousands of specimens, and in this collection alone he added some 60 new species of birds to the domain of science. Among the quadrupeds he discovered no less than 20 new species, and among the most important animals brought to light were the very remarkable nest-building ape, with its unknown and its almost equally extraordinary brother, the kulalamba, and his observations of the almost unknown gorilla were most interesting and valuable. In ethnology he accumulated a number of invaluable native arms and implements, which now adorn the British Museum. Space fails in which to recite his intense sufferings, during these explorations, from semi-starvation, the wild beasts of the dense forests, the venomous reptiles of the river valleys, the attacks of ferocious ants and other intolerable poisonous insects which infest the interior. There are many interesting accounts of curious quadrupeds in Du Chaillu's book, Adventures in Equatorial Africa, but none appeals more strongly to most readers than that of the gorilla. Traditions from antiquity, the relation of Hanno, the Carthaginian navigator of 350 B.C., set forth the existence of such an animal, but no white man had ever seen a gorilla, except Andrew Battell, early in the 17th century. Nearly 10 years before the explorations of Du Chaillu, the gorilla had been, however, brought to the notice of naturalists by Dr. Savage of Boston, who had received a skull from the Reverend J. L. Wilson, an American missionary on the Gaboon. From boyhood up, Du Chaillu had heard from the natives of Gaboon fearful stories of the cunning, strength, and ferocity of this ape, which is the most dreaded animal on the west coast of Africa. For years he had longed for an opportunity to hunt the gorilla, and when he first saw its tracks, which threw his native hunters into alarm, he relates that his sensations were indescribable, his feelings so intense as to be painful, and his heart throbs so violent that he actually feared the animal would be alarmed by them. Du Chaillu chronicles the end of his first successful hunt as follows: "Before us stood an immense male gorilla. He had gone through the jungle on his all fours, but when he saw our party he erected himself and looked us boldly in the face. He stood about a dozen yards from us, and was a sight, I think, never to forget. Nearly 6 feet high (he proved 2 inches shorter), with immense body, huge chest, and great muscular arms, with fiercely glaring, large, deep gray eyes, and a hellish expression of face, which seemed to me like some nightmare vision. Thus stood before us this king of the African forests. He was not afraid of us. He stood there and beat his breast with his huge fists till it resounded like an immense bass drum, which is their mode of offering defiance, meantime giving vent to roar after roar. The roar of the gorilla is the most singular and awful noise heard in these African woods. It begins with a sharp bark like an angry dog, then glides into a deep bass roll which literally and closely resembles the roll of distant thunder along the sky, for which I have sometimes been tempted to take it where I did not see the animal. So deep is it that it seems to proceed less from the mouth and throat than from the deep chest and vast paunch. He again sent forth a thunderous roar, and now, truly, he reminded me of nothing but some hellish dream creature, a being of that hideous order, half man, half beast, which we find pictured by old artists in some representations of the infernal regions." The explorer relates that flying gorillas so resembled men running for their lives, and their discordant cries seemed so human, that he felt almost like a murderer as he shot them. Having obtained a number of specimens, he now used his utmost endeavors to obtain an ape alive, and speaks of his success as one of the greatest pleasures of my life. To his great grief, however, the intractable and savage brute soon died. Regarding it, Du Chaillu writes: "Some hunters who had been out on my account brought in a young gorilla alive. I cannot describe the emotions with which I saw the struggling little brute dragged into the village. All the hardships I had endured in Africa were rewarded in that moment. It was a little fellow of between 2 and 3 years old, 2 feet 6 inches in height, and as fierce and stubborn as a grown animal could have been. Several were captured from time to time, but all died after short confinement. Every effort to subdue their ferocity, whether by force or by persistent kindness, utterly failed. They were never other than morose, bellicose, and treacherous." Another very interesting animal is a nest-building ape, a before unknown species, which was discovered by our explorer almost by accident. Du Chaillu says: "As I was trudging along, rather tired of the sport, I happened to look up at a high tree which we were passing, and saw a most singular looking shelter built in its branches. I asked Oboko whether the hunters here had this way to sleep in the woods, but was told to my surprise that this very ingenious nest was built by the Nshiego Mbuve, an ape. The material is leafy branches with which to make the roof, and vines to tie these branches to the tree. The tying is done so neatly, and the roof is so well constructed, that, until I saw the Nshiego actually occupying his habitation, I could scarce persuade myself that human hands had not built all. It sheds rain perfectly, being neatly rounded on top for this purpose. The material being collected, the male goes up and builds the nest, while the female brings him the branches and vines." Yet another member of the ape family, discovered by our explorer, deserves passing notice in his own words: "The Kulu Lamba has for distinctive marks a very round head, whiskers running quite around the face and below the chin. The face is round, the cheek bones prominent, the cheeks sunken, the jaws are not very prominent, less so than in any of the apes. The hair is black, long on the arm, which was, however, partly bare. This ape, whose singular cry distinguishes it at once from all its congeners in these wilds, is remarkable as bearing a closer general resemblance to man than any other ape yet known. It was very rare, and I was able to obtain but one specimen of it. This is smaller than the adult male gorilla and stouter than the female gorilla. The head is its most remarkable point. This struck me at once as having an expression curiously like an Eskimo or Chinaman. Among the worst pests of Africa are ants, especially the bashikouay, which travel in a line about 2 inches wide and often miles in length. Du Chaillu says, "They devour and attack all with irresistible fury. The elephant and gorilla fly. The black men run for their lives. In an incredibly short time a leopard or deer is overwhelmed, killed, and eaten. They seem to travel day and night. Often have I been awakened out of my sleep and obliged to rush from my hut and into the water to save my life. A Bashikouay army makes a clean sweep, even ascending to the tops of the highest trees in pursuit of their prey." The results of his 4 years of research in the interests of ethnography, geography, and natural history were placed before the public in a valuable work entitled Explorations and Adventures in Equatorial Africa. The book gave rise to bitter, harsh, unjust criticisms and engendered endless discussions. Du Chaillu's journey to the interior was entirely discredited, and his accounts of the animals and natives were characterized as mere fabrications. Discoveries necessarily develop discrepancies between the realities brought to light and existing beliefs produced through inference or imagination. Then, as has many other discoverer in science or geography, Du Chaillu learned how slow is the willingness of a jealous mind to relinquish its favorite error for a conflicting truth. Justification came speedily for the explorations of Serval and Belay of the very next year, proved the accuracy of Du Chaillu's account of the great Ogowe River, and indicated the general correctness of his map of the Ashira country. Burton confirmed his reports regarding the cannibalistic habits of the Fans, and other statements were speedily corroborated. Stung to the quick by the adverse criticisms, Du Chaillu, although suffering from the effects of fevers contracted in his long residence in western Africa, determined to repeat the journey with such precautions regarding his observations as would be absolutely convincing as to their truthfulness. Especially he determined to capture and bring to Europe a living gorilla. To ensure accuracy, he went through a course of instruction in the use of instruments, learning to make, test, and reduce astronomical and hypsometrical observations, and acquired proficiency in the then difficult art of photography. As regards geographical explorations, he had a vague hope that he might reach from the west coast of Africa some unknown tributary of the Nile, down which he might be able to reach the main river and the Mediterranean Sea. Leaving England in August, 1863, Du Chaillu's first destination was the mouth of Fernand Vaz River, about 110 miles south of the Gaboon, this point being selected both because he knew the natives and also because that river valley, being unknown, afforded him virgin ground from the beginning of his journey. In landing through the terrible surf that makes entrance into the Fernand Vaz so dangerous, Du Chaillu was nearly drowned, and all his astronomical instruments and medicines were lost or damaged. This necessitated his delay in that region until other instruments could be had from England, but the time was not lost, for he had ample opportunity of further studying the habits of the gorillas, which abound there. Fortunately he captured 4, an adult and 3 young, one of which he shipped alive to London, but it died during the voyage. Du Chaillu started on his journey with 10 Komi negroes, previous survivors, as his bodyguard, and 50 porters in place of the 100 needed, thus making double trips necessary for a while. Following up the Fernand Vaz River to its tributary, the Rembo, he left this latter stream at Obinchi and traveled southeasterly to Olenda. Here a council was held by the local chief, who forbade him to enter the Apingi country, but allowed him to proceed to the Ashira region, where he was long delayed and robbed by the natives. In crossing the Nguni River, on his way eastward to the Ishogo country, he was surprised to obtain ferriage in a large, flat bottomed canoe which carried baggage and party across in 7 journeys. Near the end of June, while traversing a tract of wild forest near Yongwe, Du Chaillu came suddenly upon a cluster of most extraordinary and diminutive huts, which he was told were occupied by a tribe of dwarf negroes. In his previous journey in the Apingi country, he had given no credence to the exaggerated descriptions and reports that had often come to his ears concerning dwarf tribes, assuming the stories to be fables. Now, however, with these curious huts before him, he pressed on, eager to obtain personal information concerning these little folks, whose existence had been vouched for centuries before the Pomponius Mela, Herodotus, and Strabo, and who were described in a fairly accurate way by Andrew Battell in 1625. In answer to Du Chaillu's inquiries, the natives said that there were many such villages in the adjacent forests, and that the tiny men were called the Obongos. He found the huts entirely deserted, but from scattered traces of recent household effects, it was quite evident that the Obongos, alarmed at the approach of strangers, had fled for safety to the dense jungle of the neighboring forest. He thus describes their habitations. The huts were of a low, oval shape, like a gypsy tent. The highest part, that near the entrance, was about 4 feet from the ground. The greatest breadth was about 4 feet also. On each side were 3 or 4 sticks for the man and woman to sleep on. The huts were made of flexible branches of trees, arched over and fixed into the ground at each end, the longest branches being in the middle, and the others successively shorter, the whole being covered with heavy leaves. On June 26, 1864, Du Chaillu entered Nyembowai, a large village in Ashango Land, in the vicinity of which, he learned with great joy, was situated an inhabited encampment of the Obongos, or hairy dwarfs, as he terms them. The Ashango natives offered to accompany him, at the same time intimating that it was likely the village would be found deserted, for, said they, the Obongos, the dwarfs, are shy and timid as the gazelle and as wild as the antelope. To see them, you must take them by surprise. They are like to the beasts of the field. They feed on the serpents, rats, and mice, and on the berries and nuts of the forest. Du Chaillu made his first visit to an Obongo encampment with 3 Ashango guides, and with great precaution they silently entered a village of 12 huts to find it long since deserted. Fortune was more favorable at the second village, where, however, no one was to be seen on entrance. The curling smoke, calabashes of fresh water, and a half-cooked snake on living coals indicated that the alarmed inhabitants had fled on their approach. A search of the huts resulted in disclosing the presence of 3 old women, a young man, and several children, who were almost paralyzed with fear at the sight of an unknown monster, a white man. By judicious distribution of bananas, and especially of beads, Du Chaillu succeeded in allaying their fears, and later made several visits, but confidence was never firmly established, and it was impossible to see the men except as they fled at his approach, or at a distance when they visited the Ashango village for purposes of barter. During his several visits he carefully measured 6 dwarf women, whose average height proved to be 4 feet 6 1/8 inches. The shortest was 4 feet 4 1/2 inches, and the tallest 5 feet and 1/4 of an inch. The young man, possibly not full grown, measured 4 feet 6 inches in height. Du Chaillu says, "The color of these people was a dirty yellow, and their eyes had an untamable wildness that struck me as very remarkable. In appearance, physique, and color they are totally unlike the Ashangos, who are very anxious to disown kinship with them. They declare that the Obongos intermarry among themselves, sisters with brothers. The smallness and isolation of their communities must necessitate close interbreeding, and I think it very possible this may cause the physical deterioration of their race. Their foreheads were very low and narrow, cheek bones prominent, legs proportionately short, palms of hands quite white, and their hair short. curly tufts resembling little balls of wool, which, according to the young man seen by Du Chaillu, grew also in plentiful, short, curly tufts on his legs and breast, a peculiarity which the Ashangos declared was common to the Obongo men. These dwarfs feed partly on roots, berries, and nuts gathered in the forest, and partly on flesh and fish. They are very expert in capturing wild animals by traps and pitfalls, and in obtaining fish from the streams, and the surplus of flesh is exchanged for plantains and such simple manufactured articles as they stand in need of. Concerning their settlements and range of migration, Du Chaillu adds, "The Obongos never remain long in one place. They are eminently a migratory people, moving whenever game becomes scarce. But they do not wander very far. These Obongos are called the Obongos of the Ashangos. Those who live among the Njavi are called Obongo Njavi, and the same with other tribes. Obongos are said to exist very far to the east, as far as the Ashangos have any knowledge." In his Journey to Ashangoland, Du Chaillu gives quite a number of words of the Obongo language. He considers their dialect to be a mixture of their original language with that of the tribe among whom they reside. It appeared that none of the dwarf women could count more than 10, probably the limit of their numerals. Their weapons of offense and defense were usually small bows and arrows, the latter at times poisoned. Leaving Mobano, 1° 53' south latitude, and about 12° 27' east longitude, by dead reckoning, Du Chaillu passed due east of the village of Muaou, Kambo, where he, by accident, while firing a salute, one of his body guards unfortunately killed a villager. An effort to atone for the accident by presents would doubtless have been successful, but most unfortunately, and despite Du Chaillu's strict orders, his bodyguards and porters had already irritated the Ashangos by offensive conduct. Overtures for blood money were interrupted by an offended chief denouncing the exploring party. Almost instantly the natives commenced beating their war drums, and Du Chaillu, realizing the danger, and loading his men with his most valuable articles, retreated westward toward the coast. Before they reached the forest, he and one of his men were wounded by poisoned arrows. Pursued by the infuriated savages, Du Chaillu restrained his men from shooting, when, demoralized by the situation, many of his porters threw away their loads, which consisted of notebooks, maps, instruments, photographs, and natural history collections. Curiously enough, the instruments and goods thus abandoned by Du Chaillu in 1864 were found in 1891 by an African trader, in the jungle where they had been thrown down by the retreating carriers, having remained all these years untouched by the Ashangos, who believed they were fetish and so regarded them with superstitious dread. After retreating a few miles, and finding that inactivity and self-restraint meant self-destruction, Du Chaillu took the offensive, and, drawing up his men in a favorable position, repelled his pursuers with considerable loss. The wounds from poisoned arrows being external, if subjected to immediate treatment, healed in a few weeks. Further explorations under these circumstances were impossible, for Du Chaillu depended entirely for his success on friendly relations with the natives. In consequence, he returned to the sea coast, and on September 27, 1865, quitted the shores of western equatorial Africa. Although the second voyage of Du Chaillu into the unknown regions of western equatorial Africa rehabilitated his reputation as a reliable observer, as far as related to geography and natural history, yet his description of the Obongo dwarfs gave rise to further discussion and aspersions. It is needless to say that the discoveries of Stanley in his last African expedition have definitely settled this question in Du Chaillu's favor, and that the studies of Lenz, Marsh, and Bastian in and near the region visited by Du Chaillu confirm the accuracy of his descriptions. Indeed, the Obongos of Ashangoland rise in proportion to undersized negroes when compared with the dwarf queen found by Stanley on the eastern edge of the great equatorial forest, who measures only 2 feet 9 inches in height. Thus in time has come complete vindication of all of Du Chaillu's statements as to the wonders of the Ashira and Ashango lands, which portions of western equatorial Africa he was the first to explore. If the geographical extent of his explorations give way to that of other African travelers, yet it must be admitted that he stands scarcely second to any in the number, importance, and interest of his contributions and collections in connection with ethnography and natural history of equatorial Africa. In later years Du Chaillu has devoted his attention to the northern parts of Sweden, Norway, Lapland, and Finland, and although his travels in these regions had no important geographical outcome, yet they resulted in lately placing the general public in possession of many interesting details of these countries, as given in his book called The Land of the Midnight Sun. His important work, The Viking Age, is an elaborate presentation of his theory that the ancestors of the English-speaking races were Vikings, and not Anglo-Saxons, and has awakened much comment in the scientific world. Ivar the Viking, his latest book, is a popular account of Viking life and manners in the 3rd and 4th centuries. End of chapter 13. Recording by William Tomco.